On the morning of June 28, 1914, the streets of Sarajevo were awash with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the murmurs of a crowd gathered to witness the passage of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. A single bullet meant for the Archduke found its mark in a nearby carriage instead, wounding a police officer who fell forward, shielding the imperial couple from the assassin's pistol. The would-be assassin, Gavrilo Princip, was seized before he could fire again. The Archduke emerged bruised but alive, his survival instantly altering the calculus of Europe. In the immediate aftermath, the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Council convened in a state of restrained urgency, rather than issuing the historically draconian ultimatum that demanded sweeping Serbian concessions within 48 hours. The Council, under the counsel of Foreign Minister Count von Sapari, drafted a softened set of demands: the release of known conspirators, a joint investigation into cross-border smuggling, and a pledge to curb extremist propaganda. The tone was firm yet measured, acknowledging Vienna's desire for justice while avoiding an outright provocation that could ignite a wider conflict. Diplomatic channels flickered alive. Berlin, bound by the dual alliance, urged caution, reminding its ally that any rash move might draw Russia into the Balkans and threaten German security. London, under Prime Minister Asquith, dispatched envoys to both Vienna and Belgrade, proposing an international arbitration panel hosted in Geneva. The Ottoman Empire, still a formidable presence in the Near East, observed with interest, aware that a Balkan war could destabilize its own southern frontiers. The result was a narrow de-escalation. Serbia, pressured by Russia but wary of outright defiance, agreed to the limited demands and allowed Austro-Hungarian investigators into Belgrade. The crisis, which in another timeline would have spiraled into a continental conflagration, settled into a tense diplomatic standoff, one that set the stage for a Europe forever walking a tightrope between peace and perpetual unease. The summer of 1914 unfolded under an uneasy quiet. With the assassination attempt diffused, European powers turned their attention to long-standing border disputes that had long simmered beneath the surface. In the Alps, Italy and Austria-Hungary negotiated over Trentino through a series of back-channel talks mediated by the French Foreign Ministry. The discussions were punctuated by occasional nationalist demonstrations on both sides, but the presence of an international arbitration panel in Geneva gave each side a face-saving exit. In the Balkans, however, the underlying currents of Serbian nationalism refused to be fully pacified. Young officers within the Serbian army, inspired by the failed plot, formed clandestine circles that exchanged pamphlets calling for a greater Serbia. Their activities were monitored closely by Russian military attachés, who saw in them both an opportunity to extend Slavic influence and a potential flashpoint that could draw Austria-Hungary into direct conflict. Meanwhile, Germany, still confident under Kaiser Wilhelm II, focused on strengthening its naval buildup while quietly supporting Austro-Hungarian diplomatic efforts. The German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, urged his allies to avoid any escalation that might jeopardize the fragile balance of power. British intelligence reported an uptick in espionage activity along the North Sea coast, prompting Asquith's government to tighten naval patrols but refrain from overt posturing. The result was a Europe marked by cautious engagement rather than open hostility. The Austrian and Serbian governments exchanged diplomatic notes more often than threats. French and British diplomats worked tirelessly behind closed doors to keep disputes within the realm of arbitration. Yet beneath this veneer, nationalist fervor continued to grow, fed by newspapers that glorified past glories and whispered of future unification. The calm was fragile, held together not by lasting peace, but by a collective desire to avoid the catastrophe that had almost been unleashed. Even as the diplomatic front appeared steady, the Austro-Hungarian Empire faced an internal crisis that threatened its very cohesion. The empire's mosaic of ethnicities, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, South Slavs, Hungarians, Romanians, and others, had long been held together by a delicate balance of privilege and repression. Franz Ferdinand, now more politically seasoned after his narrow escape, began to advocate for incremental reforms that would grant greater autonomy to the empire's constituent kingdoms. In early 1915, the Imperial Council passed the Compromise Act, which devolved limited legislative powers to regional diets in Bohemia, Galicia, and Croatia-Slavonia. The act allowed local languages to be used in administration and granted modest control over education and taxation. It was a pragmatic concession aimed at quelling nationalist agitation without dismantling imperial authority. The reaction was mixed. Hungarian leaders, protective of their own privileged status within the dual monarchy, viewed the reforms with suspicion, fearing that increased Slavic autonomy would erode their influence. Czech politicians welcomed the changes, but pressed for deeper parliamentary representation. In the empire's military, officers of diverse backgrounds began to voice concerns about loyalty and command structures, prompting a modest reorganization that placed more emphasis on joint Austro-Hungarian commands rather than ethnic regiments. These reforms slowed the tide of outright separatism but did not extinguish it. Nationalist parties continued to organize rallies, now framed less as calls for independence and more as demands for full self-government. The empire's leadership recognized that a gradual devolution was preferable to violent rupture, a lesson learned from the Near War of 1914. Yet each concession also exposed the structural weakness of an empire built on competing national aspirations. Across the eastern frontier, Russia found itself in a position it had never anticipated, spared the devastating defeat that would have followed a full-scale war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Tsarist regime, still under Nicholas II but increasingly influenced by reformist elements within the Provisional Assembly, seized this reprieve to pursue cautious modernization. In late 1915, a series of agrarian reforms were enacted, granting limited land ownership to peasant communes in the western provinces. While the measures fell short of full redistribution, they alleviated some of the most acute rural discontent that had fueled revolutionary sentiment during the previous decade. The government also introduced modest industrial subsidies aimed at expanding railway networks and modernizing armaments, efforts designed to bolster both economic growth and defensive capability without provoking a costly arms race. The Provisional Assembly, composed of liberal intellectuals and moderate socialists, pressed for greater political freedoms. Though Nicholas I remained wary of radical change, he allowed the formation of limited municipal councils with elected representatives, providing a controlled outlet for public participation. These steps curbed the appeal of extremist factions that, in another timeline, would have surged after a catastrophic war. Russia's foreign policy reflected this internal shift. While still committed to protecting Slavic peoples in the Balkans, Moscow adopted a more diplomatic posture, supporting Austro-Hungarian arbitration efforts and refraining from large-scale mobilizations. The Russian Navy maintained its focus on securing access to warm water ports rather than projecting power into the Mediterranean. Thus, Russia entered the 1910s as a nation poised between tradition and reform, a state where revolutionary fervor was muted by pragmatic concessions, and where the specter of war remained distant but ever present. Germany's fortunes in this divergent timeline hinged on its ability to redirect the industrial momentum that, historically, had been channeled into total war. With the Austro-Hungarian crisis diffused, Berlin faced a crucial decision: continue expanding its military-industrial complex or pivot towards civilian innovation. Kaiser Wilhelm II, persuaded by Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg and influential industrialists such as Fritz Thyssen, chose the latter path. In 1916, the government launched the Technological Advancement Initiative, allocating significant capital to research in electrical engineering, automotive production, and chemical synthesis for consumer use. Factories that would have manufactured artillery instead began producing automobiles, radios, and household chemicals. The policy yielded immediate economic benefits. Unemployment fell as workers transitioned from wartime arms production to burgeoning sectors like automobile assembly and electrical infrastructure. Urban centers, such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, experienced a surge in middle-class consumption, fueling a modest but stable rise in living standards. Politically, the pivot helped stabilize the German state. By avoiding the hyperinflation that would have followed an unchecked war economy, the government maintained public confidence. The Social Democratic Party, while still advocating for workers' rights, found less fertile ground for radical agitation as economic conditions improved. Meanwhile, the Kaiser's reputation benefited from being seen as a pragmatic ruler who steered Germany away from catastrophe. Internationally, Germany's emphasis on civilian technology fostered new trade relationships. German engineers exported electric generators to Britain and France, while German automobile manufacturers secured contracts in the United States. These commercial ties created an interdependence that acted as a subtle deterrent against future aggression, a network of mutual benefit that reinforced peace even as political tensions lingered. In the East, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. The Young Turks, having seized power in 1908, now faced a world where the great powers were less preoccupied with large-scale conflict and more receptive to diplomatic engagement. Recognizing an opportunity, they embarked on a series of constitutional reforms aimed at modernizing governance while preserving imperial integrity. The 1917 Constitutional Restoration Act restructured the Ottoman Parliament, granting broader representation to Arab provinces such as Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. It also introduced civil liberties, freedom of press, assembly, and limited religious tolerance that had been absent under previous autocratic rule. The Young Turks established a modern bureaucracy staffed by educated elites from across the empire, promoting merit over ethnic affiliation. Economic reforms accompanied these political changes. The government invested in railway expansion, linking Istanbul to Anatolia's interior and extending lines into Arab territories, facilitating trade and troop movement. Agricultural modernization programs introduced new irrigation techniques, boosting productivity in Mesopotamia and the Levant. These measures attracted foreign investment, particularly from Britain and France, which saw a stable Ottoman market as advantageous for their own colonial economies. While these reforms slowed nationalist uprisings, they did not eliminate them entirely. Arab intellectuals began to organize cultural societies advocating for greater autonomy within the empire's framework. However, the presence of a responsive parliament provided an outlet that reduced the appeal of outright separatism. The Ottoman Empire, though still vulnerable to internal and external pressures, managed to postpone its disintegration by embracing a measured path toward pluralism. Beyond Europe's borders, the absence of a world-spanning war altered the trajectory of colonial subjects yearning for self-determination. In Africa, educated elites in British East Africa, French West Africa, and German Southwest Africa formed political clubs that demanded representation within metropolitan parliaments rather than outright independence, a strategy made feasible by the relative stability of their metropoles. In India, the Indian National Congress capitalized on Britain's focus on domestic reform rather than war expenditure. Leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak advocated for greater legislative participation and incremental self-government. The British Liberal government, wary of unrest in its most valuable colony, began a series of constitutional reforms that introduced limited elected seats to the Imperial Legislative Council across Southeast Asia. French Indochina witnessed a surge in nationalist literature, with writers calling for cultural autonomy and economic rights. The French Third Republic, preoccupied with maintaining its European alliances, opted for administrative decentralization, granting local councils limited authority over education and infrastructure. These movements were not driven by the mythic narrative of a lost generation forged in trenches. Instead, they unfolded in a world where the rhetoric of sacrifice was replaced by calls for political agency. The lack of a global war narrative meant that colonial powers could not rely on the unifying force of shared combat experience to suppress dissent. Consequently, demands for self-rule grew louder and more organized, laying groundwork for decolonization movements that would later reshape the world order. By the close of the 1910s, Europe stood in a state of uneasy equilibrium. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, having devolved authority to its constituent kingdoms, functioned as a loose federation rather than an absolute monarchy. Germany's industrial pivot had created a prosperous middle class that valued stability over militarism. Russia, modestly reformed, avoided the revolutionary upheavals that would have followed a disastrous war. The Ottoman Empire lingered on a path of constitutional modernization, delaying its eventual dissolution. Yet peace remained precarious. Border disputes resurfaced sporadically. Italy pressed for control of Dalmatian ports. France and Britain contested colonial boundaries in Africa. Russia and Austria-Hungary clashed over influence in the Balkans. Each crisis was managed through diplomatic conferences, often held in neutral venues like Geneva or The Hague, and resolved by compromises that left lingering resentment. Economic competition intensified as nations vied for markets and raw materials, leading to trade disputes that threatened to spiral into protectionist policies. Nationalist rhetoric continued to inflame public opinion, especially among younger generations who felt constrained by the slow pace of reform. The specter of war lingered in military plans, but none were executed with the full mobilization that had once seemed inevitable. In this divergent world, the absence of a cataclysmic conflict prevented the emergence of extremist ideologies that, in our known history, would have taken root amid ruin and disillusionment. Fascist movements found fewer fertile grounds. Communist revolutions lacked the catalytic trauma of a shattered state. Instead, societies grappled with incremental change, striving to balance tradition with modernity. The story of Franz Ferdinand's survival is, at its core, a meditation on contingency. A single missed shot altered diplomatic calculus, set off a chain of reforms, and reshaped the destiny of empires. Yet it also underscores how fragile peace can be when underlying tensions remain unresolved. Europe in the 1910s was a continent forever perched on the edge of transformation, aware that any misstep could still plunge it into darkness. As we reflect on this alternate path, we are reminded that history is not a single line, but a tapestry woven from countless choices. The divergence we have traced shows both the promise and the peril inherent in each decision, urging us to consider how the smallest moments can echo across generations, shaping the world we inherit.